It's UCF game week. We're here breaking down the TCU-UCF matchup with not one but two incredible guests, plus a little Horned Frog Blitz Q&A and three games that I'm looking forward to watching this weekend. All that and more on this episode of Frogs Insider. Hey, Frog fans, welcome back to another episode of Frogs Insider. I'm your host, Jamie Plunkett. Melissa Treebwasser will be along shortly, interviewing not one but two incredible UCF guests this week as she previews TCU's game against the Citronauts. They're not Knights, they're Citronauts. We'll never let it go. We'll never let it die. Very thankful for you listening to this episode number 81. Very excited to continue rolling down this track with Frogs Insider, presented by the Flying T Club. Big shout out to our presenting sponsor, the Flying T Club. Very thankful for their partnership. If you want to know more about the Flying T Club, which is TCU's NIL collective, you can go to flyingtclub.com and see all the ways that you can get involved. When it comes to NIL collectives, the Flying T Club is the only one for TCU. They support over 110 student athletes, and it's really cool to see TCU's fan base come together and support one initiative, all pulling in the same direction to support TCU student athletes in the best way possible. And one of the really cool things about the Flying T Club is that they're a 501c3 nonprofit. They work with a bunch of organizations within and around Fort Worth. They partner TCU student athletes with those organizations so that we're giving back to the community. A very cool setup over at Flying T Club. So again, head over to flyingtclub.com to see how you can partner with the FTC today. Also, big shout out to Dave Campbell's Texas Football and the Republic of Football Network. You know and love this read by now if you've been listening for quite a while, because if you do, because if you have, you know that the Republic of Football Network is the only podcast network where you can get a show for every single one of the state of Texas's D1 football programs. We're talking TCU, SMU, Baylor, Texas and Texas A&M, Texas Tech, but also Rice and UTSA and UTEP and Sam Houston State. Just a really fun group. North Texas as well. Really fun group of folks. It's funny that we're recording this episode when we are, because as you know, if you've listened to the last few episodes, the Dave Campbell's folks, we've been in an NCAA online dynasty together. And, Melissa and I played our game the other night. And I'm just really disappointed that she's not here to talk to you guys about my 55-14 victory. JMU went into Memphis's house, went into the Liberty Bowl on senior night, and absolutely laid the hammer down on the Tigers. I know you guys were looking forward to hearing that. And I also know that you guys are looking forward to Melissa and I paying off our bet with you, the listener, after you helped get our YouTube channel to 500 subscribers. I promise you that is happening. Amazon has not delivered my smelling salts. It's been weeks. I did get an update today, though. They will arrive on Thursday, probably around the time you're listening to this podcast. And so what Melissa and I have decided is that if my smelling salts arrive in time, we will do a live stream YouTube postgame show of TCU's hopeful win over UCF, during which we will do the smelling salts. So that's coming. We have not bailed. We would never bail on you, our faithful listeners, and now our faithful YouTube subscribers. We're very thankful for you. Very, very thankful for you. We've got a great show tonight. I am very excited. Melissa has booked two of my favorite guests that we've ever had on the show. We love all our guests, but these two are incredible as well. Jeremy Tache, you probably know him from the LeBatard show over there at Meadowlark Media. He joins Melissa for a conversation, as well as Brendan Helwig also joins for another conversation about the UCF Citronauts. Very excited for both of these conversations. It's an excellent preview. You're going to be the most prepared you've ever been for a TCU opponent by listening to those two interviews. So let's not hesitate anymore. Let's just jump straight into the first one. This is Melissa sitting down with Jeremy Tache earlier this week to break down the game.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to another preview edition of the Frogs Insider podcast. I am Melissa Treebwasser. And guys, if you feel me fangirling, it's because I am sitting here with Jeremy Tache, one of my absolute favorite voices in sports, a member of my favorite podcast on the planet outside of the Frogs Insider podcast, the LeBatard show. a sideline reporter for Bally Sports with the Miami Heat. So when we could talk NBA basketball here, and also the host of Miami Mic'd Up podcast. This week's episode is going to be featuring one of my other favorite sports personalities, Mike Golick Jr. They're going to talk some football. They're going to talk some female pop stars. So that's a can't miss episode. Jeremy Tache, everybody, the big guest that I teased earlier this week on the podcast, is here with me to preview UCF and TCU for the first time ever on the football field. Jeremy, I've already told you, but thank you so much for being here with me today.
No, thank you. That intro was like so ridiculously kind. We were talking for a minute before we started rolling, and I was almost getting teary-eyed, and now you did it again, because that was so kind of you. And to think that there's even a single person in the world that's like, oh, one of my favorite voices in like sports. Come on. Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here with you. I'm so excited to talk about UCF, and like the first ever matchup between these two schools. So that's really exciting in its own right. But thank you. And to everyone listening to this, hey, thanks for giving this some time, and support Melissa because she's wonderful.
I appreciate that. I'm always amazed when people listen. Like when people comment like, oh, I heard the podcast. And I'm like, really? Okay.
Can you imagine how I feel?
No, I cannot.
It's
and I
crazy.
don't know that I ever want to. Yeah.
No, it's
like
it's,
people come to us for sports information. Like what? How did that happen? Who knew? Right.
Certainly not me.
I think it's really cool that you and I get to sit down and talk about UCF TCU for the first time ever, because I think other than the population size of these two universities, they have run so parallel over the last decade or so. TCU kind of blazed the trail of taking the long and winding path to being relevant in college football. TCU walked so that UCF could run. We both had fictional national championships that we will claim for the entirety of our lives.
I don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah,
fictional. Okay. Yeah, right? I don't know what you're talking about.
We've also both been on the outside looking in opportunities where our teams deserved it. And now we're both members of the Big 12 conference. And so the first thing that I want to ask you about is, what do you think that invite to the Big 12 meant for UCF, not just as a football program, but for the university and the fan base as a whole?
It was a huge deal. To be a part of a conference with an actual, storied history, right? UCF for the last several years, I mean, decades for that matter, was sort of leading conferences that were new, leading new alignments of old conferences, leading groups that made no sense to be on the field together. And while there are now 16 teams in the Big 12 from all over the country, it's not quite the same thing as it used to be. It's weird that a school from Orlando would be in the Big 12. In the new version of college football, it was a huge deal to be one of the schools to make that switch over. As a school that's had a history of having a rivalry with USF, the University of South Florida, it was fun to get the invite without them getting the invite.
We know about that with SMU too.
Right. So. And so, it's one of those things where I think UCF has felt like a lot of the fan base for the last, and let's call it a decade, right? That ironically, that's when I got to UCF was in 2013. It was the last year of Blake Bortles. We won the Fiesta Bowl over Baylor. And it felt like the university in its own right had arrived. Ironically, 2 years after that, we were winless. And then 2 years later, we were undefeated. Weird roller coaster of a time over the 4 years that I was at UCF. But at the same time, that moment in 2013 felt like, all right, sleeping giant sort of description was now being thrown out there for UCF. Like, oh, this university has an opportunity to do some cool stuff. And to watch over the last decade as that started to come true, right? Like there's still so much more room to grow for such a gigantic university in the middle of Florida, where you can recruit athletes from North Florida, from Georgia, from South Florida, hotbeds for talent in this country, like Texas, like California. Basically, I just named the 4 states that have the best athletes in this country, and UCF can locally recruit so many of them. Our star running back, RJ Harvey's from right down the road. So to be able to do that now with the pedigree of the Big 12 felt like, all right, this is an amazing step in the right direction, not just for football, but hey, for the baseball program, for the softball program, for the basketball programs. Every program was impacted by it. And I think that a lot of UCF fans are very excited about the future of the athletics department.
It's almost like you're professional because you really segued me perfectly into my next question. It's like you've done this before.
Weird.
where now with that Big 12 invite, with the seat at the Power Four table, whatever that's going to look like in the future, does that put UCF in the trajectory alongside the other major universities in Florida? It is a hotbed for talent, but you're competing with Florida. You're competing with Florida State, not this year, but generally. And then now maybe Miami is back. We will to be determined, but maybe Miami is back. And so do you think that UCF is elevated enough as a member of the Big 12 to be able to recruit some of the athletes that might generally look to those other programs?
Look, I think they're getting there. Perfect example. Nigel Kelly is one of our defensive ends right now. He transferred from Miami to come to UCF, and obviously transfers are a different story. It's all about playing time. Their defensive line is loaded. I'm not sitting here and trying to say like, oh, clearly he chose UCF over Miami. Head to head, there were influences involved. But what I will say is, being in the Big 12, being in that Power Four, like if UCF in the first couple years in this conference can capitalize and get to a playoff, like then all bets are off, right? Whether it's as an at-large or as a conference winner, all bets are off in terms of recruiting, because UCF is already either the number 1 or number 2 recruiting class in next year's class in the conference. And that's as a newcomer, that's as a program, but led under Gus Malzahn, a guy who has pedigree in his own right. We can talk about him, probably will later.
That's my next question.
His game management style, like his game management style and the way that he coaches is one thing, but as a recruiter, he does a heck of a job. He did a heck of a job at Auburn, and he thus far has recruited. He's far out recruited. My bad, a little stumble there, even as professionals, out recruited both Josh Heupel and Scott Frost, the guys who sort of sent us on this trajectory. And so to see, those blue chip prospects stacking up already, you have to imagine this is a huge moment for this university's football program, in that this year in particular, Miami is ascending, but both UF and FSU are seemingly on a bit of a downturn.
Pray for Billy Napier.
Hey, we go to Gainesville.
Yeah,
a huge game simply for the recruiting elements. You saw the way that some of UF's recruits responded to Miami going in there and winning. UCF's going to be trying to do some of the same things, and going and establishing like, hey, not only is this not become a Big Four, right? Like everybody always refers to the Big Three in Florida. Us UCF fans know it's already a Big Four. Even if we're the fourth, it is it is very much a Big Four. And so now, if you can capitalize and go, hey, we're a team that in this 12-team playoff era, even if we're just one of the ones on the outside looking in, we finish ranked, or we can compete in the Big 12. Like, I think a lot of UCF fans look at this season as in an open Big 12. Anything is possible. Now, could we go to TCU this weekend and lose and have all of that hope derailed right away and have the fan base fracturing and freaking out? Absolutely. That's what college football is about. But at the same time, I see personally a huge opportunity in this season to sort of start that ride toward, hey, you know what? We will occasionally snag a prospect from UF or from UM or FSU. And you've already seen it a few times where someone who was committed to UF last second flipped over to UCF. And that's been awesome to see the last few years.
Well, we've seen it similarly with TCU and Texas, too. As down as Texas was for most of their Big 12 run when both teams were in the conference, TCU dominated that rivalry. I think won 7 out of the first 9 games. And we started to see these 4-star kids that generally were auto commits to Texas flipping over to TCU, where they could play on the big stage, they could play close to home, and they could win. And so I think UCF, you're absolutely right. That's a similar trajectory. Kind of on that note, as a follow-up, we've kind of touched on just the sheer size of UCF. How does that translate into NIL? Have you been happy with the NIL spending? Do you think that they're using that? There's obviously a ton of money being spent at Florida State, at Miami, and Florida. Is UCF going to be competitive in that realm going forward too?
I don't have like the insider information to know the specifics on the numbers. What I do know is that most of the kids that UCF sought to acquire in the transfer portal, they were able to. KJ Jefferson was a huge target. They got him. I know that they didn't end up with Grayson McCall, but I know that he and KJ were being spoken to at the same time. And so maybe that was you know what? We're not going to go so hard after Grayson. We're not going to meet him at whatever that number is. But look, they did very well in the transfer portal, which
Yeah.
makes me, and they've done well in recruiting, which makes me believe the NIL program is doing well. The interesting thing that we've sort of always talked about with UCF is that because of how large our university is, and because of how large it's gotten over the last couple of decades, it wasn't always a school of 70,000. Basically, until the 90s, it was a school in the 20 or 30,000s. And so
70,000 undergrad.
it's 70,000 undergrad, like, or
Insane.
68 or something right around there. And
TCU
so,
has 12. So
right. And so, but if anything, that's the point, right? So now when you talk about like fundraising, right? When they throw out like the silly little booster fundraisers, it's like, hey, number 10 scored a touchdown, so donate $10, right? You're fishing to a much larger audience,
yeah.
And so it's almost like we've been waiting for the UCF fan base to get older in age, because that's what I was going to mention is because of the fact that we've escalated in our size so quickly over the last couple of decades. We have one of the youngest alumni bases in the country. And in turn, we don't have a lot of the oil men that are like major boosters that can give millions to a program. It's a lot more of a collective effort. Well, when you have a giant collective in terms of 68,000 undergrad, and every year you're graduating, however many students, even if it's, anywhere between 8 and 12, just because you have some kids that are going 5 years. Now, all of a sudden, you've got a huge group of alumni that you can go to that, number one, you don't need as many in terms of percentage to be hugely rich and successful, to be able to have some big donors. And then number two, those small donations can pile together a little bit easier. So you would think that if the right people are in charge with NIL, it should be something that, UCF is very well positioned to do. And I know in speaking to people with the program, like they were very excited when NIL started to become a piece of what could happen here, because it felt like it evened the playing field even more with those other schools in the state.
It's going to be fascinating to see. You touched on recruiting earlier too, and TCU and UCF have been kind of going back and forth. UCF has a higher per player average. TCU has a higher overall, and I think that's just because TCU has 24 commits. UCF has, I think, 19 when I checked yesterday. So
there you go.
These two teams, alongside Oklahoma State, Utah, probably best positioned to be annual contenders in this conference. And nobody has a bigger student body, by a mile than UCF, or, is between TCU and UCF, the two most fertile recruiting grounds that the schools are located in.
Oh, yeah.
So going to be very fascinating to see how much of a rivalry this becomes. Let's talk about Gus.
Yeah.
Gus is, to me, one of the most fascinating characters in all of college football. He has been at the highest of highs. He has felt the lowest of lows. But he seems to be the perfect person to be at this football program right now. What are your early impressions of him over his first couple of seasons? And do you think he's a guy that can take UCF not just to the playoffs, but be competitive once they get there?
Those are some, the deep sigh you heard was the contemplation I've had with myself over the last few years because of Gus, right? Because I'll start with the positives. Right. You have a guy who's led a major program in college athletics before in Auburn, a guy who's won a national championship leading an offense at Auburn, a guy who knows how to recruit, a guy who has been clearly more than willing to step into the NIL world of recruiting, unlike someone like Dabo Swinney, unlike Nick Saban wanted to. This is someone who's like, yeah, bring it on. I'm ready for it.
He was probably doing it before it was called NIL.
Absolutely.
Too,
yeah, of course he was. Of course he was, just like all these other guys were. And so he is someone who, just like you said, honestly, you nailed it. Perfect guy, perfect place, perfect time. He was the right guy to be here for this transitionary period from quote unquote group of five to now power four, right? He was the perfect guy to be at the helm. I think he is a very good coach. I think he is a very good recruiter. The negatives would be, I think he's very good and not great. And so my concern is, look, if you get me 1 year like you had at Auburn and you get me a national championship, I won't have a complaint. Be here for forever, right? But on the same note, I know the coach that Gus is, and I get worried because in some ways, not that dissimilar to Mario Cristobal, where you end up with these uber talented teams, might even win a game you weren't supposed to, but then drop one or two inexplicable games that don't make any sense. Last year, this team was better than 6-7. And they went 6-7 because they blew multiple leads that were like, it was almost impossible. I think they blew a 26-point fourth quarter lead against Baylor. Like,
yeah, that was a
it was
crazy
just
game.
insane. And so ultimately, like, you can put that on the kids in terms of their execution, but it's the coordinator's jobs to call the right plays, and it's the head coach's job to make sure that that doesn't happen. Now Gus is the play caller again. I do think that matters. I think that will be helpful on offense. I think that and we'll, I'm sure, get into some of the logistics of this actual matchup and this actual roster this season. But, KJ Jefferson being at the helm feels like the right type of guy for Gus. But, again, he's a stubborn guy, right? He brought in John Rice Plumlee, and John Rice Plumlee is going to be his guy. And a lot of UCF fans weren't so sure.
Yeah.
In some ways, maybe we're proven right in that, as Mikey Keene thrives at Fresno State, as Tommy Castellanos thrives at Boston College, took down FSU.
I didn't realize he was a UCF guy. Yeah.
Tommy Castellanos
okay.
was our guy. Like, we were all of us were like hyped and ready. He was a Gus recruit. Everybody was hyped and ready for him to be the guy. And then the loyalty to John Rice Plumlee is what drove Castellanos out. And obviously, as he balled out week one, and then KJ struggled against New Hampshire, everyone was ready to lose their minds. So all that said, I do think that, like, I am very happy that Gus Malzahn is my school's head coach. I think that he was the right guy for this moment for UCF. I think it all makes a ton of sense. And my hope is that he can continue to build the program into something special. My concern is that he may plateau just short of what the goals are, and that it really might be whoever the next guy is that's able to take UCF into a, hey, we are a perennial Big 12 championship game or championship game winner, right? Either in it or winning it, going to the playoff consistently, picking up 5-star recruits as opposed to 4-star recruit, that type of thing. I worry that it might be the next guy, but I'd like to think that Gus can prove me wrong. And who knows? Look, if somehow we go into TCU and go win big on national TV on Saturday night, you trust me, I'm going to be spending the next couple of weeks just riding the Gus bus.
Flying the flag. Let's talk about Saturday night. I can sit here and I have so many big picture questions I want to ask you about UCF, but I want to honor your time.
Well, thank you.
I think this is a fascinating matchup. I was had my feelings a little hurt when it wasn't the game day game. Why are you going to South Carolina?
Yeah.
When you could be. This has
a fun game.
It's a fun game. This could be. It could end up being a defensive struggle, but I think everyone's expecting to get a little bit of offensive fireworks Friday night. It's going to be a blackout game. The Carter, they announced, is already sold out.
Awesome.
So the atmosphere is going to be really, really electric. And I think that's why momentum is going to play such a huge part of this.
Oh, yeah.
And the team that can run the ball for 400 yards in the first half could very well steal momentum and never give it back. KJ Jefferson's a fascinating character because he obviously was the quarterback at Arkansas when Kendall Briles was the OC there. So Kendall's very, very familiar with KJ's game. But it seems like early on this season, KJ hasn't been asked to run the ball very much. Part of that's due to the fact you have, 4 guys behind him averaging 10 yards a carry. But also, it doesn't seem, I don't know if they've been saving that or if that's something we can expect. What are your early impressions of how he's performed, both in the running and passing game? And then how good is RJ Harvey, and how much am I going to hate him Saturday night?
Oh, man, RJ Harvey's good. I'll get to that in a second. I'll start with KJ. KJ has had an interesting first couple of games, right? Because you play New Hampshire and then you play Sam Houston State. And so, your expectation is you're just going to annihilate both of them. And ironically, UCF did. They covered the giant spreads in both games. And it seemed, if you just look at the box score, pretty easy. KJ Jefferson had every single UCF fan pulling their hair out on basically in the first half of that New Hampshire game, because he was like shockingly inaccurate. And it was to a point where you almost wondered, like, does he have some level of nerves playing for a new program, even though it's an FCS game? Like, and that wouldn't make sense because he's coming from an SEC program and seemingly, played big games. I don't know what it was, but his execution in the first half of that New Hampshire game was horrendous, and it had all of us a little bit worried. And then he came in and played against Sam Houston State and was everything I hoped he would be. He was calm. He was in control. He was making the right reads, hitting open receivers. And when you're playing in Gus Malzahn's offense, that's your job. Occasionally, you're going to need to go make a big play, right? But the majority of what your job is, because of the way that this rushing attack, and mind you, this is not just RJ Harvey. It's a four-headed monster.
Penny Boone
in that backfield. Penny Boone and Miles Montgomery and Johnny Richardson. These dudes are all very good running backs. And so you have this stable of guys behind you. They're going to run the ball well. Johnny Richardson right now has the worst yards per carry in the backfield, and it's 6.5 yards per carry. And I get it. They played 2 FCS schools,
but
right?
Still.
But that's how well this team is playing. 3 guys who've rushed for over 100 yards so far. RJ Harvey's in the top 10 in rushing yards and touchdowns. He's a monster in his own right. I'm fascinated to see the way that KJ plays in this game and what Gus designs for him, because I do think that this is what's interesting is, will they try to unleash different parts of this game? Will they have more designed quarterback runs for a powerful guy in KJ Jefferson? Will they have more? Will we see more RPOs this week? Will we see more just straight read options than we've seen the last couple of weeks? Giving KJ an opportunity to do things himself, and going into, gosh, dude, if you were inaccurate at home against New Hampshire, you're going into a blackout at TCU in a big game for both programs. If he can get into a passing rhythm early, I think UCF will be very successful. But it's such a wild card because we haven't seen that much from him yet. And, sometimes in these games, it's and this is where it's also a wild card with Gus, is it's hit or miss. Sometimes in these games, he has the most ingenious, slightly different game plan. And then other times he gets too cute and almost out coaches himself and tries to install, a double reverse with a sweep this direction. And all of a sudden, RJ Harvey's not really playing that much. It's actually Johnny Richardson in the backfield. And you're like, what are you doing? Just do what you do best.
Just run RJ Harvey.
Run these guys into the ground. And so, to me, I think the biggest key in this game is time of possession. The way that, and I looked back at the stats. So, because I was enamored with the idea of KJ Jefferson's measurables looking like Cam Newton's, even though he is not even a 10th of the quarterback Cam Newton was. In the year that they won the national championship at Cam Newton and Auburn not only finished, I believe, number 6 in the country in rushing, but they were top 5 in time of possession. And what that meant was there were less opportunities for their defense to make mistakes. Right? They just had the ball a lot longer. And it was because Cam Newton could rush and their entire backfield could rush. And so the hope, if you're UCF, is, hey, you have Ted Roof as your new defensive coordinator who, was an interesting hire, but thus far through 2 weeks, all the transfers have looked great. They look like they're flying around the field. And Ted Roof's defense maybe actually is better than what you had last year, which was one of the worst defenses in the country. And if they can even be mediocre as a defense, but then you control the ball for so much of the game that they can't make as many mistakes, that's how you win. And so it really is, it's all going to be at the point of attack. It's going to be TCU's defensive line against UCF's offensive line. And whoever can win that battle, I think ultimately is who will win the game.
Which terrifies me a little bit because TCU's defense was also one of the worst in the country last year. They made a kind of outside the box hire, bringing in Andy Avalos, who'd been the head coach at Boise and was kind of excused for culture reasons. It seems to have been a good fit in Fort Worth. But we're seeing a lot of pressure. And I think where TCU has gotten in trouble in their first 2 games, especially against Ashton Daniels, who is a great running quarterback. He's not KJ Jefferson, but, when he could break contain when things got off schedule, he was really successful running the ball against TCU, especially in the the first half. And because TCU is living in the backfield, they're sending pressure. If KJ can step up and through that pressure, he's going to have open field to run to. So that to me is going to be the interesting thing. It's not so much the designed runs that concern me. It's when things break down.
It's great.
And he's such an athlete and he's so strong running the football. I think that could be a real issue. I think the only way TCU can stay in this game is by containing that running game. You're not going to stop RJ Harvey, but if they can contain the pocket, they can close the pocket, and they can keep KJ having to step back and throw. That's what makes this to me.
Look, put UCF in 3rd and long. And you guys are going to have, I mean, look, it's a similar thing for most programs, right?
Sure.
Like if you put any college quarterback in 3rd and long, you're going to feel good about that. But it's especially the case with UCF because their offense is so designed to like guarantee, hey, we're going to rush for at least 6 yards on the first couple of plays, whether it's a 6-yard run, a 0-yard run, or a couple of 3-yard runs. We're going to be 3rd and 4, 3rd and 3, and be able to have any option on the table. If UCF's constantly 3rd and 8, 3rd and 9, 3rd and 10, I haven't yet seen KJ Jefferson be that playmaker throwing the football. I've also only seen 2 games where they've been up so much that it hasn't been necessary. A guy that's an interesting X factor, if it then comes down to that, will be Xavier Townsend. Because Kobe Hudson's the number 1, and I am sure, obviously, in every respect, Andy Avalos will be game planning to stop him. Townsend is a electric player. He's the kick returner and punt returner. He, in the first couple games, almost broke one off. He's a very talented, versatile player. You could even see him in the backfield, maybe with some design.
Another guy.
Yeah, I mean, he was a kid who ran for a ton of yards in high school and, was a receiver as well. Right now, he's the number 2 receiver for UCF. And, if you want to predict a wrinkle, maybe that's it, right? Maybe if UCF is trying to have a running back catch more passes out of the backfield, given the type of pressure that can be thrown at them by that TCU defensive line, maybe you even see Xavier Townsend in a 2-back backfield so that he's an option to catch some passes. So, I'm not sure what it's going to be here. And obviously in the same respect that you're concerned about the TCU, or rather the UCF offense, I'm concerned about that TCU offense. I see a team that came back late in the game against Stanford, led by a quarterback that dude's got moxie. Like I enjoy watching him play, and to see, to see a player in Josh Hoover that has that level of confidence, that's going to have the crowd behind him, that a crowd, by the way, that probably, even if UCF takes a couple of touchdown lead, isn't going to be out of it because they've already seen their team come back and win against Stanford. That kills me. Like as someone who watched my team blow leads last year, I'm not going to be confident in a win until the final whistle blows. And I just think this is going to be a spectacular game. I can't wait.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a ton of fun. Kind of on that note, at what point, what will you want to see to start to think UCF can get this win on the road? Is there going to be a type of play? Is there going to be a type of feel? Like, what will you be looking for when your confidence starts to increase?
I will feel confident when there is a drive where UCF runs the ball like 7 or 8 times in a row for 5 or 6 yards per carry. You know what I mean? It's one of those drives. And who knows? I mean, that could be the first drive of the game, and all of a sudden I could feel confident. I know that's what they're going to try to do. And so if UCF can quickly establish, like, it's not going to be a couple of yards at a time and then hoping to complete a slant on 3rd down, but hey, we're going to get some chunk plays early and quickly and be able to run that stable of running backs. I'll feel very confident because I really think that it's been fascinating so far, because really it's been primarily RJ Harvey and Miles Montgomery who has been such a shock. He was a transfer from Cincinnati, and Penny Boone was everybody was talking about Penny Boone and how exciting it was to get him from Toledo, because he was top 10 in rushing yards last year at Toledo. And oh my God, him with RJ Harvey, holy cow, and Johnny Richardson and his speed. And Miles Montgomery might be the most complete back on the whole team. That's including RJ Harvey. Like, this dude has a burst. And so what's so interesting is last year, UCF played with a really fast pace. There was a lot of hurry up offense, even though they were running the ball. And this year, that pace has been like slow and steady wins the race. So they've been winding the clock down a little bit more, subbing running backs, and just saying like, all right, bring it on. And sometimes they're going drive by drive, but other times they'll be like, all right, RJ, here's the ball for 3 straight carries. All right, first down, you get out of here. Here comes Miles Montgomery for 2 carries. All right, here's Johnny Richardson on 3rd down. Here comes RJ again. And it's been fun to watch. So I'm obviously like, I'm sitting here being hopeful that that's the type of thing that can happen against TCU, but it's so hard. It's so hard to judge with only having played 2, bad programs. San Houston State, I'd like to give more credit. They are a good program within their own right, but like neither of them are anywhere close to the athletes on TCU. And so when you're grounded and pounding and you're way faster than everybody on the other team, it's really tough to know, does that speed translate? Are you still faster than these defensive backs at TCU or these linebackers at TCU, or is this an aberration? So I don't know. I have a lot of confidence. Like I certainly have probably too high of expectations for this season. But I also like believe in this team for a reason.
If you hear about someone passing out in the press box, it'll be because UCF put together an 8.5-minute drive where they ran the ball 11 out of 13 times, and then TCU scored a minute and a half later on 3 pass plays. Like
that's exactly what's going to happen. Like
quarter.
It's going to drive me up a wall. And but what's funny about that, right, is like, whose advantage is that?
Yeah,
I don't know.
It's UCF's. If
I
you're
think
pounding
it's
on that
UCF's
defensive front, for 8 minutes, and then TCU comes back. And that, I think that's been one of the big, there's many complaints about Kendall Briles, but one of the biggest ones has been that he wants to play with so much tempo and so much pace, which is an effective style unless you can't stop anybody on the other side.
Well, and this was the issue. Honestly, this was the issue we faced last year. That was the exact problem that UCF had last year, which is that their defense couldn't stop anybody. And mind you, at least you're airing the ball out. Yeah. We were going 3 and out on 3 runs into the offensive line.
Painful.
Like, it was painful to watch. And you'd go 3 and out in 40 seconds on 3 rushes. You'd punt, and then you couldn't stop anybody. And it was like a nightmare. And especially in those moments where the other team was running the ball down your throat. So they're keeping the ball for 6, 7, 8 minutes. You're going 3 and out, and then they're doing it again. That's no fun to watch.
No.
But what I would say is that Kendall Briles and this TCU offense is far superior to what it was that we had going last year. In terms of, being able to move the ball and get the ball downfield. So I expect, like, I don't know if the final score will be a quote unquote fireworks score
on recording.
Oh man, I don't know. All right. So I'll say, just because I'm gonna pick UCF because
I'd be disappointed if you didn't. Yeah.
I'm gonna say, I'll say 34-28.
Okay.
UCF.
I like it.
And I think,
I hate it, but I like it,
right. I'm the reason I say that is I think it will feel like a higher scoring game than that. But because UCF's drives take a while, like, I think the success rate will be like a Big 12 game that should be 50-40. You know what I mean? Like, in that range. But because these drives can take a while when you're running the ball this type of way, and in turn, TCU, just to give their defense a break, might try to throw in some of those wrinkles and take a little bit longer just to sometimes give them a break. The score might be lower than the success rate of both offenses. But that's me being optimistic. That's me hoping for the best. And feeling like, look, I do believe all the things I just said. I do. I'm not saying them just to say them. I do believe that UCF can kind of pound the ball down just about anybody. Which is why I have the expectations of starting this season 6-0. Like, I really do. I want to win this game. And then it's Colorado, Florida, and Cincinnati, which are all 3 are like hyped up. Like, these next 4 games are about as fun in terms of hype as you can get as if you're a UCF fan, because you go on the road to a packed house at night in your first Big 12 opener. Then you get Colorado, which is just fun to beat up on if you can. Then we go to Gainesville, and then it's Cincinnati, who's, a team that we have some major history with now. So like, that's a very fun first half of your schedule.
Run them.
Yeah.
You could absolutely run them out, which would be fun when you can
And
beat
so
your
it could
rival.
be, and all of a sudden, man, if you're starting 6-0, then you're starting to
Yeah.
go crazy, and I will be, God, you won't want to listen to LeBatard because I will be insufferable.
Anything that gets less of Mike and Miami on the show, though, like I would much rather hear the UCF hype
So that
train.
what's gonna happen is
Mhm.
I'm gonna end up with extreme little brother energy because
Mhm.
Miami's gonna be ranked, by that point, if they're still undefeated, no matter what, they'll be like
Top at 6
6,
probably.
7, 8, or
Yeah.
higher probably, because some teams will drop off games, and even though Miami plays nobody,
Yep.
they will end up being right near the top, and we'll be like 16th. And I'll be like,
Yeah.
look at us, the 2 programs in
Yep.
Florida. Huh? How about that?
You're
Ranked
gonna
in the
get sent
top
to the penalty
25.
box
Oh,
a
nonstop.
lot in the
Yeah,
next
no,
couple of weeks, for sure.
I already warned Mike, like, hey man, if this season goes the way I think it can go for both of us, you're not going to be able to just celebrate Miami. I'm going to be in there just bothering you guys. I don't care if I get sent to the penalty box every time I bring it up. It's going to be fun.
Perfect. Last question before I let you get out of here. You've kind of hinted around it and what your expectations are, but what defines a successful season in year 2 of Big 12 play for UCF and Gus Malzahn?
That's a really good question. Look, I think that in my view, I have to try to look at this and be realistic. So like I was on a popular UCF podcast right before the season, and I predicted that the team would go 11-1.
Wow.
And that is too big of expectations to
Sure.
put, right? Like, even if that's my prediction, that can't be the definition of a successful season. That said, you're off to a 2-0 start, right? So to get to 9 wins, you need 7 more. And I look at some of these, and especially like, I just mentioned that the 3 games after this one, you should beat Colorado. Given the state of the Gators, you hope to,
Yeah.
but maybe even should beat the Gators. Now, DJ Lagway looked really good. My greatest concern with that game, by the way, just so that everybody can be clear on it, they have a bye week the week before. My concern is they fire Billy Napier going into the bye week.
You get the bye week bump.
They've got the bye week bump, the interim head coach bump.
Yep.
They're willing to pull out every trick play in the book because they don't want to lose to UCF in their first game. I'm panicked about it. I've been sweating.
Panic. That's
Yeah,
TCU fired Gary Patterson and beat a top 10 Baylor the next week. Yeah,
this
we know how that
is
goes.
literally my nightmare.
Yep.
And so I've been so worried. I'm going to that game, and I am so worried that this like dejected Florida fan base is going to get to talk shit to me afterward. Apologies for the language.
You're allowed. Sorry.
But nonetheless, I'm looking at those first, these next 4 games, and I'm looking at it as like, all right, you should get 3 wins in the next 4 for sure, right? Somewhere in there, whether it's a loss this week and then rattling off 3 in a row, whether it's a win this week and then winning 2 out of the next 3. So now all of a sudden you're 5-1. If you finish anything less than 8-4, it would be a disappointment. So I'll set the low bar on successful season at 8-4. I would say a truly successful season would be 10-2 or better. And I completely understand it's year 2 in a power conference, and maybe my my biases from how much I was able and willing to hype up the American Athletic Conference in 2017 and 18 has ruined my ability to properly put in perspective the difference in talent between what was being faced then and what is being faced now. At the same time, I do look back at some of those teams, including an SMU team led by Sonny Dykes, and I see a lot of NFL players that ended up from all of those teams. Nonetheless, this year is a pretty wide open Big 12.
Yeah.
Like there's not a perfect team. The best team was and probably remains Utah, but Cam Rising is already banged up.
Yeah.
And
35 years old. So
yeah. And like, who knows, right? And so if he's banged up and Arizona's like a weird wild card of a team that could beat like anybody in the country and lose to anybody in the country, and Oklahoma State like was great last year and then we beat them by like 40. And so like nothing is etched in stone in this conference. It's not like I'm looking at the SEC and seeing like, all right, well, there's Georgia, so that's automatically a loss. Or there's Bama, and that's automatically a lot. I look at the schedule and I'm like, I'd be more surprised if this team finished 6-6 again than I would be if they finished undefeated. That's how I'll say it.
Yeah,
I'd be more surprised if they do finish 6-6 off the Gus bus and setting it on fire. Like I'm leading the parade for letting this guy go. So like, that's how much I think the fan base can swing. I genuinely believe like this game on Saturday night, if UCF does not win this game, and it's largely because of Gus Malzahn's play calling and or the play of KJ Jefferson, like the fan base is fracturing and going into a bye week. It'll be a nightmare. So I'm praying for the win just so we can all have a nice good time and hype ourselves up before Colorado and actually want to go to Gainesville for that other game. So roundabout, I guess I was supposed to only say the score, but roundabout way of saying 34-28 UCF.
Jeremy, again, I just cannot thank you enough for jumping on with us. This has been such a blast, an absolute highlight for me. Where can people find any of your incredible work?
Melissa, thank you for having me. Your questions were great. This was so fun. Seriously, have me back whenever. I loved it. So if somehow we're looking at I don't know how it would be possible, but a Big 12 championship game, that's what I'm saying. Like,
no, you're coming out for that one.
If that happens, look,
Texas barbecue, we're gonna have a good time.
If that happens, I'll certainly be lobbying the LeBatard crew to send me out there. Maybe even with Lucy.
That's what I'm saying. Have got a road trip.
It would be awesome.
Yeah, gotta happen.
If UCF somehow makes the Big 12 championship game, I almost guarantee I will be there.
Right.
And so we'll make that happen. But seriously, this was wonderful. Thank you so much. For those of you who would like to follow me and the things that I'm doing, it's at Jeremy Tache. That's Tache on all platforms: Instagram, TikTok, Twitter. Still going to call it Twitter. Twitter's the place where I'm most active, but there's pictures of my cats on Instagram and they're pretty cute. So you should probably follow there too. And trying to do TikTok more. I'm just old enough to where it's not second nature.
Yeah. Still uncomfortable. Still,
but
I get that.
I'm trying to get there.
Not a poster, I'm a lurker.
Right. I was a lurker for a while and I'm trying to get into the posting because it's my job. And so, yeah, you can follow me on all those places. Listen to Miami Mic'd Up podcast. That's my podcast for Bally. It's really fun. I love it. I had Jessica Smetana on last week. I had Mike Gold Jr. on this week. The 3 weeks before that, I had Miami Marlins players, and I probably will next week as well. So the majority of those interviews are South Florida sports based. I will say in October, I am supposed to have several members of the Miami Heat on the podcast, including potentially Jimmy Butler and Bam Adebayo. We'll see. That's the hope. So yeah, that's fun. And then obviously, as Melissa has told you to do, listen to the Dan LeBatard Show with Stu Gatz. If you want to, if you listen to this and you're like, wow, that guy stinks, I'd love to see him get bullied. Listen to the Dan LeBatard Show.
That is exactly the thing to do.
Yeah, because that happens quite a bit. It's all love, though. Everybody loves each other. It's all bits.
It's all a bit.
But yeah, Melissa, thank you seriously so much. This was a lot of fun.
All right, we really appreciate it. Looking forward to an absolute banger of a game Saturday night. I will be paying close attention to your Twitter feed throughout the contest, I am sure.
Yes,
thanks so much,
absolutely.
Jeremy.
Thanks, Melissa.
Awesome. Thank you so much to Jeremy for taking time out of what I can only imagine is an insane schedule to talk a little bit of UCF football with Melissa. Again, check out the Dan LeBatard Show. You can find him there yucking it up and just being generally awesome with that group of folks who do such a great job in the media space. This next person is Brandon Helwig, another incredibly knowledgeable UCF beat writer. Melissa sat down with him earlier this week as well. Let's go ahead and listen to that conversation now.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to another edition of the Frogs Insider Podcast. I am Melissa Triebwasser, joined this week by Brandon Helwig of UCFsports.com, who is here to preview something that's never been done before. That is preview a TCU-UCF football game, because these two teams will be meeting this weekend, Saturday night, for the first time in either school's history. I'm excited about it. Brandon, I know you've got to be excited about it. But first off, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. We just started this week off. We had a little press conference earlier today at UCF with Gus Malzahn. Of course, he was heaping the praise on Sonny Dykes and Kendall Briles, and there's that whole relationship with Kendall Briles and KJ Jefferson, UCF starting quarterback who came from Arkansas. His best seasons at Arkansas were working with Kendall Briles a couple years ago. So there's that kind of parallel as well. And UCF fans, we're just excited, for this week because while it's not the season opener, it kind of feels like it is in a way because UCF had 2 warm-up games, begin the year with FCS New Hampshire, played Sam Houston last weekend. And so it just UCF hasn't really been tested these first 2 weeks, and everyone just is amped up about this opportunity to go to TCU. I know you mentioned the 2 schools have never played. It just seems like these are the 2 new. Now it's all thrown out the window with all these new Big 12 teams this year, but it just seems like UCF and TCU haven't really. I mean, like you said, didn't play in football last year, and in men's basketball, I don't think the 2 teams met until the very last game of the regular season when everyone's already kind of thinking about, conference tournaments, that stuff. So I don't feel like there's been a lot of connections yet between these 2 fan bases, but I know it'll get going this weekend.
Yeah, and I think this weekend will be a great way to kind of kick off what I feel like could definitely be a good Big 12 rivalry. It's a blackout game. It's a night game. I've already seen some of the fan accounts on social media going back and forth today. So I definitely think, these schools probably couldn't be more polar opposite when you look at size and location and makeup. But I think in the athletics programs, there's a lot of similarity. UCF kind of walked the path that TCU walked in earning its way to the Big 12, over a decade ago, having to prove they could win at the lower levels, having a supposed national championship or at least an undefeated season where they looked really dominant, and to earn that Power 4 now invite. In this year 2 of the Big 12, how do you think their adjustment has been? And how do you think they are kind of not, I don't want to say catching up, because it seems like they're already a potential contender.
Yeah, well, first off, I just want to commend TCU because they kind of created the blueprint for programs like UCF. And I know back in the day, obviously TCU was part of the Southwest Conference, but they were one of the teams on the outside looking in, and they earned their way. I mean, they earned their way into the what do you want to call it, BCS, Power 5, or whatever we were calling it a few years ago with what they did in the Mountain West and what Gary Patterson was able to do. And so, yeah, and personally, I UCF's played SMU every few years or so. So, I know you do the same thing when you would go on these trips. I always like, exploring different campuses. And, I think, I can't remember what the first year I did. I know that I've done at least 2 or 3 times, but, I'm there in Dallas. I want to check out TCU. And I think the last time I did it was 2021. I think at that point we knew UCF was going to be joining the Big 12 in a couple years. But so it was cool just kind of getting in the stadium and taking a look around and everything and just seeing it. It's a beautiful campus. It's a beautiful facilities, and what you guys got in the basketball arena with the Hall of Fame and all the uniforms on exhibit and stuff. It's just really, really cool. But what was your question? I sort of rambled on a little bit.
Saying, in year 2 of been officially, how has the adjustment been, and where do you think UCF is on their journey to being a conference contender?
Yeah. So UCF gets they know they're going to the Big 12. They get the invite around the beginning of the 2021 season. That's Gus Malzahn. That's his first year at UCF. He's already started to overhaul recruiting a little bit. I think, Josh Heupel was a previous coach. He's doing great things at Tennessee, but recruiting was the one area that was probably not Heupel's strong suit. COVID didn't really help that either with the virtual visits and all that stuff. So Gus Malzahn comes in from Auburn. I'm sure everyone's kind of familiar with his tenure at Auburn, was kind of up and down with their fan base. And after a certain period of time, they wanted to make a change, and UCF had the late coaching change because UCF's AD went to Tennessee, and then he took Heupel with him a few weeks later because they needed to hire a new head coach. But ever since that Big 12 invite came in, I mean, Gus Malzahn's been recruiting for the Big 12, kind of selling the vision. UCF still had to play one more year, 2022. In the American, where they made it to the championship game before losing to Tulane. But they've been kind of gearing up for this. And I think it was kind of I don't want to say it was a rude awakening, but they really learned a lot about what they needed and kind of how they needed to build their team. Now, UCF did have the most success out of the 4 newcomers last year. They were the only team amongst Houston, BYU, and Cincinnati to reach a bowl game last year. But I just think Gus realizes that they needed more depth. I think they were thin, as far as defense last year, particularly. He made an offseason change at D coordinator, brought in Ted Roof, who was coming from the Big 12. He had been in Oklahoma the last couple of years. I guess he had a falling out with Brent Venables, but he came in to overhaul the defense. They really loaded up on transfer portal when you look at that side of the ball, particularly just, they needed linebackers. They needed some guys in the backfield and everything. And so they really loaded up. That's been the biggest difference. And like I said, it's only been 2 games against New Hampshire and Sam Houston. So we really don't know exactly how improved this UCF team is. But from the looks of it, they're much improved defensively. And that's not just coaching, that's talent as well. And that's, I think, kind of what Gus learned last year, because when you go on the road and you're facing a team like Kansas State, and then you see, UCF had Baylor as their home opener last year and completely just collapsed in the fourth quarter. And that was a game that they, should have won, like a 90% chance of winning that game, only to see everything completely collapse in the last 15 minutes or so. But, UCF lost, some close games last year. There was an Oklahoma game that, came down to the wire, couldn't pull it out. But then they shocked the world. They beat Oklahoma State, a game that, everyone was thinking Ollie Gordon was going to run all over UCF's run defense, which was the worst, I believe, the worst in the Big 12 last year. So that's an area.
Worst at TCU's, but
so with the portal, I mean, that helps. I mean, you can create, over the course of an off season, you can kind of fill those holes that maybe would have been a little bit harder to do in years past. So we'll see where the chips fall this year. I know UCF likes the team they have. Obviously preseason predictions had Utah and Kansas State kind of the leader of the pack, but it seems like if you look at the top 8 or 9 teams, I think you can make an argument that all those teams kind of feel like they have a chance to contend for the Big 12 championship. And, I don't know if that's going to happen or not, but I know UCF feels like if all goes right, and KJ Jefferson, who I mentioned earlier, the quarterback, he kind of had a rough first week, but I think he was the number 1 rated quarterback in the Big 12, according to the PFF grades this past week. He really rebounded in week 2. So if he can play at a high level, I think UCF has a chance to do something this year in the Big 12.
Yeah, I mean, UCF was my dark horse pick. In the media poll, I went with what everybody went with. Utah and Kansas State and Oklahoma State is kind of my top 3. But to me, UCF is definitely the one that's not being talked about as much, has the best chance to make it to Arlington for a Big 12 championship because of a lot of the things that you mentioned. They have an obviously very innovative offensive coach. They've restocked on defense. Still probably not quite where they need to be to win a championship, but they certainly could end up there if the chips fall correctly. You mentioned, before I get to the specifics on offense and defense, you kind of touched on this, but what would be a successful season? If you think that there's a goal, is there a marker? Is there a game they have to win? What would define success for this iteration of UCF football?
I think it's about, taking that next step up. And for UCF last year, they did reach a bowl game. I mean, I think in that end, it was a successful season to a degree. I know as far as the program, as far as Gus Malzahn, they saw last season as unacceptable because then UCF lost the bowl game to Georgia Tech. And I guess we've seen Georgia Tech's having a little bit better season this year, but finished the season 6-7. And Gus Malzahn and all his years as a head coach, whether it was high school or, in college, he's never had a losing season. So I know that kind of ruffled his feathers last year. I think for me, I think in terms of the UCF fan base, they want to see the recruiting successes, the transfer portal successes, because Gus wins the offseason. I think I haven't looked to see if it's I think UCF right now is number 1 recruiting rankings in the Big 12 as far as this next recruiting class. I mean, I know UCF and TCU are kind of neck and neck as far as that goes, but Gus has had a lot of off-season successes. They want to see that translate to the actual season. And I think for the fan base, they would like to see, you never know what's going to happen in this conference race. It's tough. There's 16 teams, there's going to be some good teams that are on the outside looking in. But I think it would be important for UCF to play meaningful football the last couple weeks in November. There's a road game at West Virginia. They end the season on Black Friday against Utah. I mean, that game could mean something. I just think for UCF, I think they would like to get to, give or take 9 wins or so and be in the mix for a Big 12 championship. I think that's kind of the expectation amongst the fan base, at least.
9 wins would be a very successful season. Like you mentioned, 16 teams in this conference. It seems that a lot of teams are kind of in that similar mix. So 9 wins would be a big year. I mean, I think TCU fans feel similarly in that 7 wins would show marked improvement. 8 wins would be a successful season, but 9 lets you really feel like you're moving the right direction. And just to kind of finish your point on recruiting, TCU currently number 1 in the Big 12, UCF number 2, but I think that has to do with number of commitments.
I know it's gone back and forth a little bit as UCF has gotten commitments. Maybe they had a decommitment a couple weeks ago that might have impacted that number, but I know both schools have basically been at the top of the Big 12 rankings.
Well, and UCF does have the highest average for like recruit rating at over 88, so they're barely edged out TCU. I think these two teams probably are best positioned to be the best recruiting programs in this conference going forward, which should mean that both of these teams are consistently playing late important games in November and hopefully playing for Big 12 championships across from each other for a while. Let's dive in to the specifics. You mentioned KJ Jefferson, like you said, didn't get off to a great start, but certainly looks like the type of quarterback that can be incredibly successful in Gus Malzahn's system. Somebody that TCU fans really wanted out of the portal to come in and potentially challenge Josh Hoover. Hoover's looked better than fine in his first 2 starts, and he has played at least a Power 5 or Power 4 opponent in Stanford. But what are the early returns on KJ, not just through these first 2 games, which are difficult to evaluate, but what you guys saw and heard out of camp, and how do you think he's fitting into his role, and is he good enough in the passing game to elevate UCF to that 9-10 win mark?
Yeah, that's an interesting link because I think we kind of forgot about that. When he came out in the portal, I know UCF was instantly linked to him, but TCU with the Kendall Briles connection as well. Did he take a visit to TCU? Do you know?
As far as I heard, he was never given an offer, but I don't know if that's reliable information. I know there were conversations. I don't know if it ever got to the visit part of the equation.
Yeah, but he comes in and he's pretty much tailor made for what Gus Malzahn likes to do. Gus actually recruited him out of high school. KJ's originally from Sardis, Mississippi, and his dream, KJ going through high school. Obviously, players of that era, everyone looked at Cam Newton and saw what he was able to do at Auburn, playing for Gus Malzahn, and his dream was to play for Gus Malzahn at Auburn. But at that point, I believe Gus, he got a commitment from Bo Nix, and so they weren't going to take any more quarterbacks in that class. Bo Nix has the legacy from Auburn, so obviously he was always going to Auburn, but that relationship was already set in high school. So when he hit the portal, and last year, UCF knew they needed a portal quarterback. They had kind of swung and missed on a few of the guys in early December. Tyler Shuck from Texas Tech, who ended up going to Louisville. Grayson McCall from Coastal Carolina, he ended up going to NC State. So they were, I think in Baylor's quarterback, or DeQuan Finn, who was from Toledo, now is at Baylor. They kind of kicked the tires on him too. But when KJ was a little bit of a later portal entry, I think it was more in that mid-December time period. And as soon as I saw that name hit, I thought, this name I'm sure is going to be linked with UCF, and it didn't take very long at all to figure out they were hot and heavy with him. And so Gus said it, I think, when they announced his signing in early January, that he felt they really hit a home run. And so now it's all about just kind of making it work, because we kind of have seen college football these first couple weeks. Was it like 60-something%? I think of college football teams are playing a transfer at quarterback. So every team, Notre Dame, let's say Riley Leonard. So we see all these programs are kind of working through. Some of them are going through growing pains. It's not an instant chemistry fit. So that's just something that I know KJ's been kind of working on since he got to UCF this past spring, is just kind of getting comfortable with the offense, getting comfortable in the passing game, because in that debut against New Hampshire, the season opener on the Thursday night, it was rough. I mean, everything else about that game was great for UCF. The defense was dominating, albeit against an FCS opponent. The running game, which is really going to be UCF's strength this year. I mean, they look fantastic. Offensive line looked great, but KJ Jefferson really struggled throwing the ball. Like he couldn't hit the side of a barn. He was overthrowing guys. He threw it, one interception. There was other balls that should have been intercepted. He looked bad. I mean, there's no sugarcoating it. He looked pretty awful. And so going into Sam Houston this past weekend, everyone was kind of wondering, like, is he the answer? Are we going to have a quarterback controversy if he doesn't look very good? But he, to his credit, I know coaches say things on these coaches shows, whether they're true or not. I know Gus on Thursday night said this was the best week of practice that KJ has had since he's been at UCF. I've kind of heard stuff like that from coaches before, and whether it's true or not, I don't know. But he performed a lot better. When you just go by the PFF grades, I think he was a 92. I don't know if you ever look at those or not, but that's an elite grade. That was the top rated quarterback in the Big 12 this past week and one of the tops in the nation. But he was very efficient. But they won't. He with UCF's running game, and they pretty much have 4 running backs who could start at a lot of places, and that's led by RJ Harvey. He rushed for 1,400 plus yards last year. He already had more than 100 yards against Sam Houston, and that was just in the first half alone. So with that running attack, if they get going, KJ, won't have to, he won't be forced to throw the ball a lot. If they stack the box, obviously he's going to have to throw. But, getting that passing game going, I know is something that I'm anxious to see how he does against TCU, because he's not going to be facing New Hampshire or Sam Houston this weekend.
Yeah, and it's going to be interesting because TCU's run defense was so abhorrently bad in 2023. If you saw what K-State did against that unit, it was ugly from the get-go. And RJ Harvey is one of those truly, truly special backs. But like you mentioned, he's not the only great runner in that backfield. Penny Boone, Miles Montgomery are both off to really solid starts. You've got 5 guys now averaging over 7 yards a carry, which is absolutely insane. Though Ja'Cory Brown is doing it on pretty limited snaps. What is it about this unit that makes them special, especially RJ Harvey? What is kind of his bread and butter? And then how good has the offensive line had to be in order to enable this? Or is it just they have special players behind them making their job easy?
It's a little bit all of the above. RJ Harvey is an interesting story. He was originally a quarterback in high school, as a lot of times the best athlete on the team plays quarterback in high school, and so he was a quarterback for a team here in Orlando, Edgewater High School, and he wanted to play quarterback. So that's what schools are recruiting him, and most schools like UCF, when Josh Heupel was here, was just like, we're recruiting you, we want you, but we think you'd be a running back. But so he originally went to Virginia. Who said, hey, we'll give you a chance at quarterback. And I think he was there for like 2 days or 2 weeks. And they said, we're going to move you to running back. And so he didn't like that. He's like, well, if I was going to play running back, I just would have gone to UCF. So that's what he did. He hit the portal, after his freshman year at Virginia. And it's kind of been a process for him. He's had some setbacks with injuries. I think in 2021, which would have been Gus's first year at UCF, he was on track to be UCF's starting running back, and then he tore his ACL in preseason, like a couple weeks before the season was going to start. So he was out that entire season, and so his first year is kind of being one of the top options at running back was 2022, and then this past year really was his breakout. Ended with 1,400 yards. I think it was really one of the best rushing seasons that UCF has ever had, at least since Kevin Smith back in 2007 was running wild with George O'Leary's offense. That year, Kevin Smith finished second in as far as the single season rushing to nearly eclipsed Barry Sanders' single season rushing record, but. His vision is one of the best I've seen in terms of just knowing where the holes are going to open up, and obviously tremendous speed. But then UCF's depth. You mentioned Miles Montgomery, a transfer from Cincinnati. He was their backup last year, but he's looked amazing this year. I mean, I don't think UCF misses much of a beat at all when RJ's not in the game. I mean, he's kind of like a missile firing out of a cannon coming out. What analogy I want to use, but when he bursts through the hole, I mean, he is lightning. And he's looked really good. And there was a lot of hype before the season about Penny Boone. He was I think the max offensive player of the year last year. He also rushed for 1,400 plus yards at his previous school, Toledo. He was originally going to go to Louisville. He was there in the spring. He was maybe going to go to Kentucky. You know how it is with transfers. You transfer one place, you don't like what happens in the spring, I guess you can transfer somewhere else. So that's what he did. He ended up at UCF after first going to Louisville in the spring, and he's kind of been that second half guy, just to kind of give RJ and Miles a rest. But their running back room, and Johnny Richardson's a guy who's been here 5 years already. So that's a really good unit, and honestly, I think it's the best in the Big 12. I mean, I know there's a lot of talented running backs in this league, but I just think when you look at the depth that UCF has, I personally, maybe I'm biased. I probably am. I think it's the best.
Well, between the depth in the running back room and what KJ Jefferson can obviously do running the football, it's potentially terrifying for TCU fans, especially because Ashton Daniels had a lot of success running against that TCU defense in the Stanford game. And even last week against LIU, they were able to break contain a little bit and let the quarterback get out and run. So I think that's going to be the interesting matchup is, can TCU either put UCF in a situation where they can't just run the football, or will they be able to at least contain that talented unit enough to make it where Gus has to call more passing plays to keep the TCU defense honest? That to me is going to be really the story of the game. Really quickly on the defensive side of the ball, like you said, it was a unit that struggled last year, that didn't come in with a ton of hype this year. What is maybe one or two things that you've seen from the defense that gives you encouragement as they move into tougher competition?
Yeah, and like I've said a couple times, with the level of competition that UCF has played, it's kind of hard to really hang your hat on it quite yet. But just from what we've seen, is that the run defense looks a lot much improved over last year. I think they were. If they weren't the worst, they were right up there with the worst run defense in the Big 12 last season. UCF has a deep defensive line. They did have an injury issue of late. One of the backup D tackles, John Walker, he's out at least for a few weeks with a knee injury. But they do have a little bit of depth there. The UCF linebackers are much improved. They brought in Deshaun Pace. He was arguably one of Cincinnati's best defensive players the past few years. He was part of their 2021, college football playoff team. He comes in over the offseason. Ethan Barr was a two-time team captain, I believe, at Vanderbilt the last couple years. He's a team captain now at UCF. He's UCF's middle linebacker. They brought in some depth. I mean, they basically can go 4 deep at linebacker, which, that's what every program should have. But last year, UCF literally had one guy maybe at linebacker that was maybe two. Like the second linebacker really probably wasn't up to Big 12 standards, and they had to play like every snap. Like UCF's depth was so bad. They had Josh Seliskar, one of UCF's defensive ends. He would play every single snap in a game. That's how, even in that position, they just had no depth. And that's unheard of. I mean, you don't have defensive ends usually playing every snap in a game. That's crazy. But that's the area between, transfers and some of the transfers that, may not have had as much. There were some transfers that had a little bit more hype than others, but UCF brought in a couple guys. One was a corner from UAB, Mac McWilliams. Another was a safety, I believe, from East Tennessee State, Sheldon Arnold. Those guys have played really well this year. That's kind of the cool thing about the portal. Sometimes there's these guys that you may not know their names, or you may not know where their schools are located sometimes, but they do really well at different levels, and they get the opportunity to go to a bigger program and really shine. But I'm just anxious to see how these guys do against a real legit Big 12 team. We all got questions going into this week, and that's really what I want to see. Is this defense as good as advertised?
Yeah, I mean, to me, this is like when I saw game day was going to South Carolina or whatever, I was like, honestly, what a missed opportunity, because TCU-UCF has a chance to be the most fun game of the weekend. I'm fascinated to see how this one plays out. I think these are two teams that could very easily be knocking on the door of playing for a Big 12 title, or could be struggling to get to 7 wins. Like, I just think there's so many unknowns. I think UCF is really well positioned to be playing, like you said, meaningful games the last couple weeks of the season. And I unfortunately think they're really, really good, which I don't want to have to say going into, the Big 12 opener against them. It makes me a little bit nervous. But to me, this is going to be a great environment. I was super impressed with the TCU student section the first half last week against, a team that no one even knew existed. They had the 4th highest student attendance at a football game in school history. I have a feeling they might break attendance records Saturday night. The weather is supposed to be perfect. This is a couple of undefeated teams rolling up, and the first time they've ever played. I think it's going to be a really, really electric environment. For UCF to come on the road, to go into TCU, which is not, some powerhouse program right now. It has a ton of question marks. But what do you think needs to go right on Saturday night for UCF to start conference play 1-0?
I think UCF needs to have the KJ Jefferson that, did really well against Sam Houston, had the same KJ Jefferson show up. Just because there've been some whispers. I know I kind of talked about it earlier, but just, we don't really see much in terms of the offseason. Like, spring practices are closed, preseason practices are completely closed. When the media can go in for like 15 minutes and see the team doing warm-ups and stretching, but we really can't see any real football.
Gus went to the Gary Patterson School of
yes.
Involvement, huh? Yeah,
so, but
zero.
Yeah, but you hear whispers and different things coming from the program, like, KJ had a really bad scrimmage or was not looking good, and UCF's top donors, they call them shareholders, they were able to attend one of the UCF scrimmages in August, and some of the people really weren't all that impressed with KJ then. So there were some whispers that he was struggling a little bit, and so so that's kind of been a recurring issue. But I've also heard that he's more of a game quarterback than a practice quarterback, which I guess is the only thing that really matters, right? I mean, it's how you perform in the actual game. So UCF needs KJ to have a good game, and I think they're going to lean on those running backs. So they're going to make TCU try to stop those guys. And on the other side of the ball, UCF defense I think they've been able to force four turnovers through the first two games. I know it was lower level competition, but they've done a pretty good job of turning the ball over, and that needs to continue as well. But the big question for me, though, is how is this team going to play on the road? Because they struggled on the road in Big 12 play last year. Whatever it was, or just travel, or just the level of competition. They have not really proven to be a great road team under Gus Malzahn, and maybe there's certain reasons for that, opponents being played or whatever. But this is a big statement game, for UCF and for Gus, just to show that they have a good opportunity if they can get past TCU. You have a bye week, and then Colorado comes to town for the Big 12 home opener in the Bounce House, which obviously the whole circus sideshow with Dion in prime time.
You talk about electric environments. The Bounce House is going to be rocking for prime.
Yeah,
for sure.
But they've got a great. I think personally, TCU is the bigger test than Colorado. We'll see what happens, but
on
after
the field,
on the field anyway. So if they can get past TCU, I think they've got a great opportunity to be 4-0 going into what will be much anticipated, hyped non-conference matchup. UCF goes on the road to Florida the first week of October. This is a huge test for UCF, and I know some fans. I don't want to say Gus is not on the hot seat, not at all, but just some fans, they want to start to see results from Gus, and this is a big game to kind of win those fans over if UCF can beat TCU.
So do you want to go on record with a prediction for Saturday night?
I hadn't thought about it, but I can come up with something on the fly. I do like UCF's chances. No disrespect to TCU, and I know it was the first game. I did see most of that opener against Stanford. I know it took TCU a little while before they were able to get on top and pull out the win. I know it'll be a lot tougher, than UCF's first two games, obviously, but I like UCF's chances in this game. I think they're going to win a close game. I'm thinking something along the lines of maybe 31-24, something in that range.
Yeah, I think, I just looked up the spread, and it's 1.5 points, which is, basically might as well be a pick 'em, right? And for a road team to only get 1.5 points seems pretty insane. So I'm very anxious for this one. Like I said, I think the environment's going to be great. I think this is obviously far and away the toughest challenge TCU has faced this season. And sets up a tough stretch for the Horned Frogs. So I think, just like you were saying for UCF, this is a huge momentum game for TCU as well. So two teams that are going to come in with a lot on their shoulders in this one, and it should be fun to see how it goes. Brandon, tell folks where they can find you, find your work, find all of your insight on UCF as someone who has been covering this team since they were turned a legal adult, which is kind of insane.
Yeah, well, I've been the longtime publisher of UCFsports.com, part of the Rivals Network. I'm UCF Sports on Twitter, and I'm looking forward to it. I've been through TCU and Fort Worth, just kind of sightseeing, but I can't wait to see what the atmosphere is going to look like on Saturday night. I think it'll be a great showing of UCF fans. I mean, like pretty much every university in the country, they've got a alumni contingent in Dallas Fort Worth. I know UCF has a decent group there. So between those guys, and I think this is probably going to be the highest. Everyone just kind of circles, what road games you want to attend and everything. And it seems like amongst the fans from Florida, it seems like this is probably will be the most popular road trip. I'm not sure exactly, how many fans. It'll at least be a few thousand, I would think. But I know this should be a popular game for road tripping UCF fans.
Well, I know it'll be a popular return trip for TCU fans whenever that gets put on the schedule, because we all want to take a little swing through Disney World too. So, Brandon, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate your time. Look forward to what we're all hoping, I think, is a pretty epic start to Big 12 play this year.
All right. Thank you very much for having me.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Brandon. Similar to Jeremy, just thank you both so much for taking the time. Absolutely incredible to have both of you on the show this week. Super excited for folks to hear those conversations. If you're listening to this, you just listened about those conversations. So let us know, whether it's on Spotify or Apple or on YouTube channel, what you thought about those two interviews that Melissa did. I thought they were excellent personally. I think she nails it every single week with those previews. Does a fantastic job of finding guests, and she's proven that once again this week. So incredible. All right, let's jump in to a couple of other things, because I haven't done one of these in a while. But I did drop a little thread over at Horned Frog Blitz today, where I do a little bit of writing, to get some questions from TCU fans. We haven't done a mailbag, so we're doing a mailbag. I got some really good questions. Looking forward to that. And then once the mailbag's done, I've also got 3 games that I'm paying attention to beyond the TCU and UCF game this week that I just wanted to give a little bit of insight into. But let's go ahead and jump into this mailbag. Thankful for everyone that responded. Let's go ahead and get this rolling. Let's start. Hoosier Frog 18. Will we see some changes on offense and defense on Saturday that we didn't see against Stanford or Long Island? I think it's safe to say yes to that, because I don't think TCU really showed anything against Long Island. I think they ran like 11, 12 total plays, mostly the same formation. They did a lot of work late in that game to get Ken Seals and some of the backups some reps as well. Typical FCS game, like we broke it down on the last episode of the podcast. I think part of what we saw against Stanford, really, truly, the reason that game was so close was the mental errors, right? And so I do think there's maybe a little bit left in the tank, left in the back of the playbook for this game against UCF. And also, really, this is the 3rd straight week that TCU has seen a mobile quarterback. And so I'm interested to see as well how Andy Avalos keeps things fresh for this defense and keeps and if he's kept some of the scheme off of film for this game. It's tough to do when you've been in the industry as long as Andy Avalos has. Obviously, he did a great job at Oregon. We know about his time at Boise State as well, at Fresno State. And so this is a guy who's been around for a long time. People kind of understand what he wants to do defensively, but I think he's probably still got a wrinkle or two prepared for KJ Jefferson and UCF as well. Hyperfrog says, I don't follow PFF very closely. Is it normal to have such a disparity between a unit's run blocking and passing grade? Across the line, they all seem to pass block much better. This is a good question, and it kind of gets into PFF's grading methodology, which personally I don't think is as sound as it could be. So first and foremost, it is dependent on the individual and on the line collectively for the grades to vary as much as they have for TCU these first 2 games, especially along the offensive line. And the reason for that is a player receives a grade for every single play, but they receive their grade as much for the result of the play as they do for their own individual performance on the play. An example, say that you have a quarterback who dumps off a pass to the running back. The running back is covered but manages to break free, runs 25 yards, scores a touchdown. The quarterback will get a positive grade for that because the play scored a touchdown. But what the grade doesn't account for is the fact that, hey, the quarterback threw it to a covered running back coming out of the backfield when he had a slot receiver 15 yards downfield waving his arms because there was no one within 20 feet of him. And so there's a little bit of discrepancy there when you're getting rewarded for the results of the play as much as you are your own individual participation in it. And so for TCU's run blocking grade, part of the challenge there is that they're also being graded for what happens on the play. So maybe they do block up well, but the running back doesn't see the hole, tries to bounce it outside, gets tackled for a 1-yard loss, when in reality, he probably could have had a 5 or 6 yard gain. Offensive linemen will get dinged for that. Similarly, if they block up well and Josh Hoover throws a touchdown, they're going to get rewarded exceptionally well for that, but they're also going to get rewarded if Josh Hoover avoids the sack and gets the throw off and TCU advances the ball downfield. So there's a little bit of an interesting methodology there for PFF. That wasn't a perfect explanation. That was a high-level explanation, but just to kind of give you an example of where their grading originates from. It's partially due to the individual's performance on any given play, and it's also partially due to the result of the play. And so I think when you see a major discrepancy there between run blocking and pass blocking, there's a lot more going on than simply offensive lineman performance, if you get what I'm saying. Original babyface. Will Haas spring from a wheelchair on the sidelines during the game and run the offense for one series? No. No, he will not. Would be great. Would be a very WWE-like moment, but no. Corrupted Frog. Who ends the game with the better touchdown to turnover ratio between KJ and Josh? I think this game pretty simply comes down to that stat. That's interesting. I think both quarterbacks have done a pretty good job of protecting the football this year. I think KJ Jefferson's only thrown 1 interception. Josh obviously hasn't thrown any, but he did have the mesh point fumble against Stanford, which blame that on him, blame that on Cam Cook. I personally think it's more 50-50 there, but he does get credited with that fumble. And I agree, though, with the overall sentiment corrupted. I think that the quarterback who makes fewer mistakes is generally the quarterback that's going to see their team win. And in a game early in the season, when you've got two very talented rosters getting after it, I think it is important for the quarterbacks to do what they can do to be efficient, to manage the game, to not make too many mistakes. If this was last year, I would say I'd give the edge to KJ Jefferson a little bit, because we did see Josh with that kind of gunslinger mentality, loving to throw the football around a lot, making throws maybe he shouldn't. But we haven't really seen that from him yet this year. He's done a much more disciplined job of getting through his reads and making the right decision on any given play. And I think we see a continuation of that against UCF. We'll get into it in a question later on in the Q&A, but I think this is going to be a real challenge for UCF's secondary in this game. They haven't been tested this year. They played New Hampshire and Sam Houston State. So I think that Josh Hoover in this passing offense for TCU is going to be a pretty big test for them. And I like what I've seen from Josh Hoover so far this year, so I like him heading into this game. Next question, also from Hyperfrog. Have any UCF players... Oh, God, I should have read this before. Have any UCF players ever eaten dog or cat meat? I don't know. What a debate, though. What a debate. Quite the state we're in, isn't it? Quite the state we're in. Pluto Brown says, no KNOW, so like knowledge, no. Run stopping. No run stopping. No KNOW. No victory. No run stopping mentally. No victory mentally. As opposed to NO, no run stopping. NO, no victory. I love that. No run stopping, no victory. No run stopping, no victory. Fully agree. I mean, UCF has over 800 rushing yards this year. They have 11 rushing touchdowns. Both lead the country. Yes, against inferior opponents so far, but there is no trick here. This is how TCU has to win this football game, is they have to slow down the running game because UCF is very, very good at it. Ultimate Frog, will Paul Oyewale play? That's the rumor. Sonny Dykes at his Tuesday media availability said he was optimistic, that he was hopeful that Oyewale would play. He did practice on Tuesday. But we saw this trend in fall camp when media was allowed to be out there, that he'd be suited up, doing some stuff on the sideline. Next day there'd be a red jersey. He'd be suited up the day after that. So a lot of rubber banding when it comes to his recovery. I would like to see him play. I think that if Sonny's bringing it up in a press conference, there's a good likelihood that he will play. But He also said there was a good likelihood that Dalen Wright would play last week, and we still haven't seen Dalen Wright this year. So take what coaches say in press conferences with a grain of salt. But I do think that it's a signal that Oyewale is progressing a little bit closer to seeing some playing time. Frog says, does Josh Hoover's ADOT stay the same, go up, or decrease as a result of this game? For those that don't know, ADOT stands for average depth of target. It's how far down the field a quarterback is throwing the ball on average. Does Josh Hoover's season average completion percentage stay the same, go up, or decrease as a result of this game? It's a great question. I am curious to see how UCF's defensive front holds up. They have not generated a ton of pressure on opponents this year. That's largely due to injury on the interior of the line. They've lost 2 really, really good defensive tackles so far this season already. And like I said, I think this is going to be a pretty big test for UCF's secondary. I like Hoover's ADOT to go up maybe a tick, especially if we see Dalen Wright, especially if we see Eric McAllister more like we did in week 2 against Long Island. I like to see it maybe go up a tick. And when you're throwing the ball further downfield, the likelihood is that your completion percentage might drop a little bit. So I would say for this game specifically, we're going to see Josh Hoover's ADOT tick up. We're going to see his completion percentage stay about the same, because I still think we're going to see a really good mix of that intermediate and short passing game, passes out to the flat right behind the line of scrimmage, that kind of stuff. That'll probably balance out the percentage just a little bit. Wahoo Frog, over under 125 total yards rushing for TCU. I don't have the stats in front of me. Have they hit that yet this year? I know it's against Stanford and Long Island. I don't know if they've hit that yet this year. This is going to be one of those situations where, run blocking is going to be really important. Decision making from running backs is also going to be equally important. I do think that TCU wants to run the ball better, so I think we see them make a concerted effort. They're not going to get away from the ground game completely, but I think Kendall Briles also knows and is confident in Josh Hoover's ability to throw the ball 35 times a game. I think when you start to get into that 40, 45 range, you're a little too out of balance as an offense, but TCU's confident in Josh Hoover. They're confident in his ability to lead this offense down the field. I will take the over on the rushing yards, though. I think this is a game where the running game and the offensive line starts to figure it out. TCU Ball 3 says, please break down UCF's O and D lines. Can TCU win the line of scrimmage? I think this is a game where TCU can win the trench battle. I've already mentioned the injuries along the defensive line. We haven't seen UCF have to pass block a ton this year. KJ Jefferson, not the most efficient passer in the world. He was decent in the 2 seasons that he worked with Kendall Briles at Arkansas, but last year at Arkansas, his passing dropped off pretty significantly, as did his yards per carry. When you have a one-dimensional offense, when you can't throw the football, defenses can sell out to stop the run. And I'm curious to see if UCF really tries to throw the ball a ton, or if they're content to continue to just try and run for 400 yards in the game. If that's the case, I really like TCU's chances, especially in the trenches, because we've seen a very aggressive, mostly gap-sound defense from the front 7 this year for TCU through 2 games. And if UCF is going to concede the passing game altogether, you can throw an Abe Kamara in the box as well and have 8 ready to rock. I think this is a game where TCU can absolutely win the trench battle on both sides of the football. But I also know fully well that this is the most talented roster that TCU has seen this year, and so I'm interested to see how the Frogs respond to that challenge. Next question from Life of a Frog. In 2 games, UCF has run 150 offensive plays, with 111, or 74% of them, being running plays, kind of going back to what I was just talking about. TCU, on the other hand, has run 143 plays, with 71 being running. Obviously, the poor competition in the early season kinks has dictated most of the play selection. My question is, UCF wants to lean heavily into the run game instead of the pass, while TCU desires to be balanced. It clearly knows it has to throw the ball to be effective. Run game is spotty at best. We just talked about it. So we have a classic run versus pass game here. Whose defense is most capable of forcing the other to play the way they don't naturally lean? This is where I think I give TCU the edge. It's as much for health as it is for talent and scheme. I don't see a world where Josh Hoover is going to be made so uncomfortable that TCU is going to have to adjust in the passing game a whole lot. I do see a world where TCU is going to be disruptive enough in the running game to put UCF in some unfavorable downs and distances where KJ Jefferson's going to have to become a passer. And I really think that situation favors the Horned Frogs. That's not to say that KJ Jefferson can't throw the football, that he's not good at it, but they do have a propensity to run the football, and there's a reason for that. His strengths are in the run game. When you have a guy who's 250 pounds, who can run between the tackles, who gives you an extra blocker in the running back, that gives you a significant advantage in the run game. If TCU is able to negate that and to shut the run game down to an extent, I don't think they'll fully shut it down, but slow it down enough, I think that KJ Jefferson's going to have to become a passer, and I think that favors TCU. Frog Lover, do you have enough trust in our secondary to stack the box against UCF's potent run and leave our corners on islands with lesser limited safety help? I do, more so this year than in 2023, because we've seen what this defense is capable of just from a four-man front and from a blitz package perspective, to know that this defense is more capable of generating pressure. When you're generating pressure, it's not easy to be a cornerback or a safety in coverage, but it becomes a lot easier because you're only defending for 3-4 seconds instead of 5, 6, or 7. And the longer you're in coverage, the more likely it is that a receiver is going to get open. So if TCU can generate that pressure up front, and again, force KJ Jefferson into being a passing quarterback, I like TCU's chances in this ballgame. Super Philman asks, end of year, do we look back and say our O-line was poor, adequate, above average, or elite? Same question for the defensive line. I think we look back and we say that this offensive line was somewhere between adequate and above average. They haven't quite figured out the run blocking yet. Pass protection has been pretty good. But I think that what we tend to forget, and I know that this is going to sound like an excuse for TCU, and I'm not trying to make one, TCU's already down an offensive lineman. They were expecting the San Diego State transfer to come in and be probably your starting left guard. And the fact that he's out for the season, yes, it's next man up, but you can only recover so much, especially when you've constructed an offensive line the way TCU has, where you've brought a lot of guys in the portal. You already have to get guys on the same page and synced up both on and off the field. They have to be able to trust each other. They're working through a lot this offseason, and we've seen them working through some of that on the field in the first 2 games. So I can see a world where TCU improves along the offensive line as they get a little bit sturdier and more aligned with one another. But I think that when you're already missing a guy who was penciled in as a starter, the ceiling naturally maybe lowers just a hair. And that's not necessarily a slight on the depth of TCU's offensive line, but you do have limited resources. It's not like you can just go out and get 15 new offensive linemen to replace the one you lost. You've got to play the hand you're dealt. And I think TCU's line has held up reasonably well so far. There are very glaring issues in the run blocking game. And if they can get some of that sorted out and just be an adequate to above average offensive line, I think we're going to see TCU have a lot of success on offense this year. As for the defensive line, I think we're gonna come back and we're gonna say that this was an above average to elite defensive line. I love the talent on that side of the football. I think that Nana got his first sack of the year against Long Island. He talked this week about tearing up when he walked onto the field, just being back in his hometown, playing in front of family. Devin Deal has looked incredibly good. Cooper McDonald has looked very good. We've seen a lot of sparks from Marcel Brooks as well. The interior of the line held up well against Stanford, and I think they can be disruptive against UCF as well. And I think that momentum is just going to continue to build as TCU gains more confidence on that side of the football. Mantikos, he's got 2 questions for us. The first one, is our offensive line unathletic, which is why we can't seem to effectively pull, limiting our run effectiveness? I don't necessarily think it's an athleticism thing. I think it kind of goes back to the comfortability thing and the trust stuff. Not that they don't trust each other, but just that it takes time for an offensive line to develop chemistry. And I don't think we've seen them fully hit their stride yet. I think they will continue to get better as the year goes on. Question 2 from Mantikos. What are the keys to the game against UCF? And based on everything you've heard behind the scenes, how good will we be against UCF's run game, especially QB run? That's a good question, and again, UCF is the leading rushing team in the country for a reason. After the first 2 weeks, I think they've leaned a little too one-dimensional, mostly because of opponent. If TCU can make them do things that they don't want to do, put them in third and longs, I think that TCU is going to have a high likelihood of success in this football game. You're going to have people that are still willing to hit KJ Jefferson in the fourth quarter, because that's something that a big quarterback can do to people, is wear you down, and it becomes a test of willpower at that point. And I'm curious to see. We know that that TCU has some hard-nosed football players on this football team. Johnny Hodges comes to mind, Nnamdi Obiezor comes to mind, Abe Kamara comes to mind, Cooper McDonald comes to mind. How much are they going to be as willing for contact with KJ Jefferson in the fourth quarter as they were in the first? That's the question. I'm not saying that I know the answer. I'm not saying yes or no definitively, but I truly think that that's going to be a part of the game where, hey, if KJ Jefferson wears them down and is all of a sudden his 2-yard runs are turning into 5, 6, 7-yard runs in the fourth quarter, I think TCU's in a little bit of trouble there. But if they can contain the run, if they're as willing to hit him in the fourth quarter as they were in the first, I think things are going to bear out pretty well for TCU. Let's see. Will FTX asks, is KJ Jefferson closer to being Cam Newton, Blake Bell, or Colin Klein? This is a really fun question because Sonny mentioned in his Tuesday press conference, he kind of gave the comp of KJ Jefferson. He gave him Cam Newton. But this is no slight to KJ Jefferson, but Cam Newton could sling the football. Cam Newton threw the hell out of the football. He was a very good passer. He was accurate. He had an incredibly strong arm. Like there's a reason he got picked where he got picked and had the NFL career that he had. Because yes, he was a big physical runner who asserted himself in the ground game, but he could sling the rock. I haven't seen KJ Jefferson throw the football in that way. He's a fine passer, but he's not Cam Newton. I like the Blake Bell comp. I really like the Blake Bell comp. Even with Colin Klein, I think he could sling it a little bit more. Was a better passer than KJ. So I'm going to go with Blake Bell on this one. Annoying Group of 20 asks, do you think the Avalos defense can play with heat but also reduce the over-pursuit breakdowns? Who needs to have the biggest game for the Frogs run D? Is this the 2024 game Abe Kamara crushes a QB and running back's soul? All right, to the first part. Reducing the over-pursuit breakdowns. It's similar to stealing bases in baseball for me. Do you change your level of aggressiveness when you get thrown out one time? No, you shouldn't, because that comes with the territory. When you are an aggressive base runner, same with being an aggressive defense, you're always kind of walking that fine line between being just aggressive enough or being out of position and overcommitted. And there are going to be moments where, because of their aggressiveness, this defense over-pursues, doesn't correct in time, and gives up a big play. That's just going to be the nature of the beast this year. We saw it a couple times in that Stanford game with Ashton Daniels running the football. So I don't necessarily think I want to see a reduction in the over-pursuit, because that would be an indicator to me that they're being generally less aggressive, and I'm not sure I want to see that. Who needs to have the biggest game for the Frogs run defense? I mean, pick a linebacker. They're going to be put between a rock and a hard place a lot of times in this game, making the decision, hey, is this guy on the sweep getting the ball? Is KJ Jefferson keeping it? Is he handing it off to the running back? They're going to have to make some quick and disciplined decisions. They're going to have to stay incredibly gap sound in order to shut down this run defense. So just take your pick of the linebackers. I think they're all going to need to have really good games. Is this the 2024 game Abe Kamara crushes a quarterback and running back's soul? It's got that vibe. It's got that vibe when you've got a run-first offense and you can drop your strong safety, drop your nickel into the box, and do some hitting. We know Abe Kamara loves to do some hitting, and this might be the game where he gets to really just tee off a couple of times. Task Force Frog. What's your starting 11 on defense for TCU to shut down the UCF run game? Any changes in the secondary? If Bud Clark's healthy, if he's over his sickness, then I think he's back in. Although, oh my gosh, drawing a full blank. drawing a complete blank, and Melissa's not here to save me and bail me out. The kid who started on behalf of Bud Clark on Sunday, as I vamp very quickly, go to the snap count article. Here we go. This is great radio. This is great YouTube content. Subscribe, by the way. If you haven't subscribed yet, hit that subscribe button. Do it. Do it. Make sure that you share with a friend as well. We've gotten there now, and I am thinking of Richard Toney. Thank you for being patient with me in that moment of forgetfulness. Richard Toney had a really good game against Long Island. I don't think he starts, though, against UCF if Bud Clark is healthy. So I'll say Devin Deal and Nnamdi Obiezor on the edges. You've got Caleb Fox and Tymon Mitchell in the interior of that defensive line. Your linebackers are whatever stud, probably Cooper McDonald to start. Johnny Hodges and Nnamdi Obiezor. You're going Abe, you're going Jamel, you're going Bud, and you're going Lemarion, and you're going with JT Broughton. I think that's your starting 11. And until one of them does something to not be a starter anymore, that's going to be the starting 11 moving forward. So I think there's some stability there. I don't think you get into the third game of the year and say, oh gosh, it's a Big 12 opponent. Let's move away from what worked the first 2 weeks. TRF51 says, is it obvious that the biggest issue on this team is the offensive line? It seems the coaches did their best to address it, and we brought in a ton of people. Do they just suck at coaching the position, or do they suck in their player evaluation when deciding who to go after? I know they need to play together, but I'm not sure subbing the way they do is doing the starters any favors. So, kind of already talked about it, but you lost one of your starters before the season ever began, and you were already trying to replace 4 guys off the offensive line from last year. So there are going to be growing pains. It's just it's just a fact of life, right? And I think that something that is challenging for a lot of college football fans generally, not saying this is UTRF, just saying generally, is that recruiting and development are still cyclical things. And so when you get into a situation like TCU where Sonny got on campus and the cupboard was pretty bare from an offensive lineman standpoint behind Brandon Coleman, Steve Avila, Andrew Coker, and Wes Harris, right? They brought in Alana Lee because they didn't have a center. You saw the results of that in 2023, and then you lost 4 guys off of that offensive line. They've done a fantastic job, in my opinion, of recruiting high school offensive linemen, but those guys aren't going to come in and play as freshmen. That's just not a reality. So you still have to address some of the deficits in the portal, which is why they got Colton Deary, James Brockermeyer, Remington Strickland, Carson Bruno. But when you lose a guy to injury out of that bunch, your options are, do we rely on a younger guy, or do we shuffle a transfer over that maybe we weren't anticipating playing there? They were fully set, I think, on Carson Bruno being the 6th offensive lineman. And now he's the starting right guard. Colton Deary slid over to left guard, where he didn't play a ton in 2023. He was a center at Maryland the year before, right? So you've got guys that have transferred in who haven't played together, who are still maybe learning some of their new positions, and that's going to cause some issues up front at the beginning of the year. I think A.J. Ricker is a fantastic offensive line coach. I think he's an incredibly good evaluator of talent as well. Look at some of the guys that he recruited to SMU who transferred to other places this past offseason. Look at who he brought over from SMU with him in Alana Lee. Look what he did moving Brandon Coleman to left tackle in 2 seasons. He's starting for the Washington Commanders now. Steve Avila, talented as he is, developed a tremendous amount in 2022 under A.J. Ricker and became the starting left guard for the L.A. Rams because of that, largely because of that. And so I think the talent development is there. I think the talent evaluation is there, but they're just in this kind of limbo right now when it comes to their offensive linemen. I think 2025, you're looking at an opportunity to have a much more stable offensive line than you have either of the past 2 off seasons. And so that's definitely something to keep an eye on. But I still think truly that this line is going to get better as the season moves on. Let's see. Who else we got? That might have been the last question. Nope. Manticos asks, what's up with Dalen Wright? Is the price not right? I think I listened to Jeremy and Jeff's podcast after we recorded ours this week, and I agree with Jeremy insofar as I expected Dalen to play. I mean, we got the same update about Dalen that we got about JoJo, and we saw JoJo out there on the field. So I'm not really sure what's going on with Dalen at this point. Have done a little bit of digging, haven't really found out a ton. But at the end of the day, regardless of what the reason is, if a player's not feeling right, if the staff's not ready to roll him out there, any other kind of extenuating circumstances, I think TCU's shown that they've got depth at that position. Look at what Jack Besh did, having not played at Z all offseason and then going out and dropping 140 receiving yards on Stanford's head. So they've got some depth. They've got some talent. They want Dalen on the field. But at the same time, they're also, I don't think, going to wait around. And so whatever the issue is, whether it's an injury or something else, I think it's okay to say when he gets there, he gets there. In the meantime, let's focus on the guys that are out there, All right. Loaf with another one. Interesting early stat that seems relevant. UCF and TCU have both limited inferior opponents in yards, but UCF is statistically last in defensive sacks and one of the worst so far in tackles for loss. That's surprising unless they are dropping a ton and working coverage stuff, if there's anything there. TCU should be able to carve them up. If there's anything there, TCU should be able to carve them up. Yeah, part of that's injuries to that interior defensive line. I mean, they've been ravaged by injuries there already. They lost two guys who were all conference at that position before the season even began. So you're already, similar to TCU on the offensive line, you lose your starting left guard before the season starts, you're already dipping into the well more than you want to. And that's UCF along the defensive line. And I don't know, I mean, I haven't gone and watched all of UCF's first two games this year, but I'm going to assume that they were working on a bunch of coverage stuff because they were so far ahead in both of those matchups for the majority of the game. But yeah, and I talked about it earlier. I think there's an opportunity there for TCU to really put some pressure on this UCF defense. And if TCU can do that successfully, protect Josh Hoover, keep him upright, and get the ball downfield, I really think TCU's going to come away with a win in this football game. Ludacliff asks two questions. One, will you turn Melissa's mic up, please? Yes. Number two, which is the better mascot, a Citronaut or a Knight? It's the Citronaut. I mean, come on. Talk about going backwards with your mascot, UCF. Jesus. Absolutely brutal. It's Citronaut all the way. Peace Frog. This is, I believe, the final question. Would a legless comedian still be a stand-up comic? This is a very good question. Like, ethically, morally, yes. But one of my favorite jokes is from a streamer that I like to watch. His name's Tim the Tap Man. I don't know if you know him. He's a pretty big streamer. I'm sure you've probably heard of him if you're in that space at all. But he loves to do this dad joke, and as a fellow dad, I love it. He says, I would be a great stand-up comedian. I just prefer to sit. And that's going to do it for I've got 3 games. I got 3 games to talk about. We're going to hit those real quick. Arizona State against Texas State. Arizona's favored by 1.5. I like Arizona State by more than that in this game. Arizona, Kansas State. Kansas State's a touchdown favorite. Both of these teams struggled in week 2. I think Kansas State gets it. I don't know if they get to 7, though. I'm looking for that one to be a close one. And then the Apple Cup, Washington State against Washington. Washington State is a 4.5-point dog at Washington. Give me the Cougs. That'll do it for this episode of the Frogs Insider Podcast. It was a long one, but thank you for hanging in there. Be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Hit the like button. Hit the subscribe button on the YouTube channel as well. We will be back for a live stream post-game show on the YouTube channel. So if you want to be a part of that, we'll be taking questions. We'll be talking to the viewers that whole time. Make sure you're over at the YouTube channel. You're subscribed over there. Go to flyingtclub.com. Check out how you can partner up with the NIL Collective for TCU. And again, big thanks to Dave Campbell's Texas Football for all they do for us as well. Until next time, I am Jamie Plunkett for Melissa Triebwasser, for Jeremy Tache and Brandon Helwig. We will talk to you next time